All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming. We are so thrilled to have Dr. Mariam Rahmani here at USC and back in LA with us. So the way that this event actually materialized was it was about a year ago, maybe a little bit closer to the summer. My fabulous graduate student in comparative literature, Manur, texted me, and then literally like 2 days later, my fabulous colleague Ketki, who's in history, Dr. Pant, texted me and said, "Have you read Mariam Rahmani's Liquid? If you haven't, you have to. Do you know her? It's great. You got to read it, and we got to talk about it." And so then I immediately, Mariam Rahmani went to got her PhD at UCLA in comparative literature, which is where I went. We didn't overlap, which makes me feel very aged, but that's a different conversation. But so I was extremely excited, and I have 6 very close friends from the comparative literature PhD program that I went to at UCLA, and I immediately texted them, and so we all got the novel, and we had like a very active text message thread going on about it. We had a lot of feelings about Adam, FYI, and then we all got together and talked about it, and it was really amazing. So then I reached out to Ketki and Mariam and said, should we, Manur, and then said, should we bring Mariam to campus? And they immediately said yes, of course, and was very excited. And Manur took the lead in organizing this event, so very, very excited to have you here. And I have my fabulous comparative literature class here. And we've been, as I was mentioning too, we've been studying the city novel in a variety of different ways. And so I feel like your novel fits in I have all in all kinds of interesting, fits and misfits in all kinds of interesting ways. And I have questions for you about that. So the way that we are going to structure this event, I'm going to formally introduce Mariam Rahmani to you all shortly, and then we've asked for her to come up and introduce the novel to you. I know some of you have read it, some of you haven't. Come in, Catherine. And then you talk a little bit about the novel, introduce it, and then read a little bit from it. And then I've asked Manur to be the official respondent and give us some reflections on the novel. When Manur and I first got together to talk about the novel, one of the things that was really striking was it resonated in so many ways between us as kind of diasporic South Asians, not just in academia, but in comparative literature, which is its own thing. Like, complit is its own thing. And and I have a lot of complit students in the room, but for those of you who don't know, comparative literature has a very different history, departmental history and disciplinary history than, say, English. It really emerges out of exiles and emigres and refugees, particularly Jewish emigres and exiles who are fleeing Nazi Germany at the time, and they're also bringing with them the theoretical discourses of continental philosophy and theorizing their own states of exile and exilic consciousness, their own sense of fractured self, their own sense of alienation. And so that's why we have such a theoretical emphasis in comparative literature, and then that coupled with the desire to study literatures in non-Anglophone and non-European languages, often, which I think for many of us in the diaspora, ends up being tied to all kinds of desires for lost homelands and lost mother tongues and all the kind of fictions and material conditions that comes with. So it attracts comparative literature attracts a very particular kind of student and produces a very particular kind of consciousness, a very particular kind of political consciousness, but also a very particular set of desires and longings and neuroses that this novel so beautifully lays out. It's one of the things I really loved about it and what makes it such an amazing comparative literature novel, among many other things. This was something that Manur and my conversation ended up sparking a lot of, making me think about as like kind of 2 different generations of people in comparative literature and our kind of very emotional and intimate relationships with the novel. And then I had this amazing conversation with my colleague Ketki, and Ketki really got me to think in all kinds of interesting ways about what it means for this story and this subject and the protagonist of this novel to unfurl in the form of a romance or a rom-com with all the kind of tropes and conventions of a romance. And so I'm very excited for you to ask questions about this. But so we've been sort of just buzzing with ideas and thoughts and conversations, and we're so excited to bring you into them. Okay, so Manur will give a kind of response, and then we will open up to questions. Keithy and I have questions, and we'll kind of go from there. So before I officially introduce you, there are a couple of thank yous that are important, and do want to thank the Department of American Studies and Comparative Literature for co-sponsoring with the Center for Feminist Research. I want to thank Manur for doing all the organizational work and the legwork and being so enthusiastic with this event. And then last but absolutely not least, Sam Glover. Where's Sam? Oh my gosh, Sam does all of the work, does all of the logistics, does all of the the heavy lifting, and so that this can all look very easy and effortless. So we don't know what we would do without you, Sam. You are a dream to work with. Thank you so much. Okay, so any questions? All right. Mariam Rahmani is a writer and translator and holds a PhD in comparative literature from UCLA and an MFA in fiction from Columbia University. She currently serves on the faculty of Bennington College and on the advisory and editorial boards of Acacia, a new magazine for the Muslim left. Her debut novel, Liquid, has been acclaimed in outlets like the New York Times Book Review, The Atlantic, Vanity Fair, British Vogue, and many, many others. Liquid was named an Oprah Daily Most Anticipated Book of the Year and a March Book of the Month Club main pick. It is currently being translated into Italian, Dutch, and Croatian. Amazing.
Yeah. Croatian's the most fun.
Amazing. Yeah. Vanity Fair calls the novel a smart, addictive debut. British Vogue calls it bitterly funny, a stylishly arc literary debut. There's two reviews I want to that I also pulled that I want to read because they capture such different dimensions of the novel. It almost sounds like they're talking about two different novels, which I think speaks to the richness of this novel. Review from the New York Times Book Review. Quote, describes it a wry, mercurial book about the horrors of being on the market, both in romance and in academe. Profound, unanswerable questions about the Academy's relentless mistreatment of its workers, the mortifications of compulsory heterosexuality, and the emotional inheritances we receive from our parents. Glitter at the edges of certain passages like shards of glass, end quote. Another review from The Atlantic reads, Rahmani is in many ways reinventing the Iranian-American novel, subtly yet substantially. In Rahmani's novel, Iran is an actual setting for flesh and blood characters rather than a silent specter. Rahmani's universe is never quiet. Everything is spoken, often exhaustively and exhaustingly, in writing so electrically alive that the reader feels fully immersed in her world, end quote. All right, let's welcome Mariam Rahmani.
Thank you. Oops, forgot about the mic. Thank you so much, Neetu, for the introduction. Thank you, Manur, for the invitation. Thank you, Sam, certainly for dealing with my many logistical questions. And thank you, everyone, for being here, for taking your time to be here. So what I wanted to do, and I will just time myself so that I don't go on forever, was just give you a little bit about the book as I read, but really try to center the reading. So let's see, I'll start this. Okay. Yeah, this book came from, a pretty personal place. I mean, it's not an autobiography, it's not a memoir in terms of the events, but the frustration that's in the book with the academic job market, that was certainly mine when I was writing it. And also the passion that's there, in a lot of ways I always thought about the book as a love letter to LA, And I think that it's also a love letter to comparative literature, because ultimately she does kind of find heart. The book finds some heart, and it is by engaging the same questions and the same critical framework that pushes her to see the world around her in a clear-eyed way and be critical of it, is also what pushes her ultimately to choose love in some sense. Not really just romantically, but I think in an important way, like in terms of where she is investing her time and energy by the time she gets to the end of the book and her own work. So that's just a little on how I was thinking about the book as I was writing it. In terms of, reading right now, today, it's incredibly difficult, I think, to read in a moment in which there's an active war happening that I certainly didn't anticipate when I was writing this book. And I think in a lot of ways was not even anticipated when it came out only a year ago. So we're in LA. If this reading were not in Los Angeles, I was only going to read from the Iran portions to try to honor a version of that space before the destruction. But given that we're here, I'm going to read from both halves of the book. And we'll see if we have time, though, maybe to kind of lean it towards Iran. But yeah, I'll maybe leave some of my further comments to our conversation. But just to really reiterate how thrilled I am to be here, I've had an opportunity to read in a lot of spaces with this book, and when this invitation came, it really was just the one that was the most meaningful. And I thought, okay, like it's found its way. The book is reaching the right people. So thank you. So yeah, I am actually going to start us with Adam, a kind of controversial character, in some ways a cynical character. We can get into all of that. This is very early in the book, from chapter 1, just after the prologue. Okay. And they're in K-Town. I don't know if that'll come up, but incidentally. Okay. Adam was my closest, oldest friend. Both scholarship kids, we'd met at a reception the first week of college, paraded before alumni who were trying to swallow a few canapes and spit out as many allusions to Milton before death. Given that our particular grants came courtesy of the class of 1944, the alumni we'd been assigned to chat up were all white men, and few. Our college held the distinction of being the last Ivy to admit women, just 1 year shy of 1984, a date so dystopically futuristic that it had met Orwell's needs. Between alternately refusing to engage with me or laughing loudly at my non-jokes, their uneasiness around me provided a strong argument for co-education. And that's not even getting into the race stuff. They either stared at my hijab or clung to eye contact, awkward and unblinking. But Adam was a hit. When he approached, the men's shoulders sighed, and the accordion folds of their frowns fell open. It wasn't just that he was another white guy. After all, he wasn't one of them. They were rich, and he at least poor enough to be on scholarship. What Adam had was charm. A charm so practiced it came naturally. Jokes seasoned with sincerity, a slight leaning in when he spoke. But over the men's hunched backs, he locked eyes with me conspiratorially, rolled his eyes at the next inanity, or slipped me a wink when they pretended we had something in common. Moneyed Americans want nothing more than to feel middle class. Not to be, but to feel like they're just like anyone else. If I learned one thing in college, it was that. Adam already knew. He had spent his preteen years making himself scarce as his mother conducted studio visits in the living room of their Venice Beach bungalow, and his teenage years doing the Thursday night gallery circuit with her, studiously attending other people's openings. He'd fancied himself an artist at age 10. As fate would have it, his confidence was less misplaced. Where his mother Sharon had all the pretensions that console the failed artist, Adam enjoyed the slack elegance afforded by skill. We were still in college when his first chapbook was accepted for publication, winning a prize. Powered by senioritis and cafeteria coffee, we burrowed through Manhattan and into Brooklyn for the better part of an afternoon, surfacing deep in Bushwick, where he collected his 10 authors' copies and $1,000 in the form of 50 rumpled 20s packed in a recycled manila envelope. Still a working poet, meaning he wrote poetry while working in marketing. He'd published 2 books since. He had a 3rd manuscript ready. I'd sent him notes last week. With each book, his art had matured. The poems were frank, embodied, and generally improved, I was sorry to admit, by his dysfunctional relationship with Julia. Heartbreak is rich soil for the artist, and he'd gotten at least 3 heartbreaks and books out of a single relationship. So Julia's his on-again, off-again girlfriend. But book to book to book, the best poems turned on an unrequited love. This capital Y haunted his oeuvre. She predated Julia, and I assumed would outlast her. A fiction, as far as I could tell. So how's your life shaping up? Adam speared a piece of meat. What number course I'd lost track and kept it on the fork. I'm a 31-year-old without a summer job. Sex life? He took the bite. None to speak of. Love life? Another bite. Even less. What about fall teaching? His hands lingered over the dish, which was seemingly replenishing itself with each bite. Can you make up for the loss? My plate was already empty, and I had a passing urge to throw it at the wall. The chair's ignoring my emails, and my parents think I'm an old maid. I'd received a disconcerting email to this effect just last week, sent from my father with my mother CC'd. The threat of a setup was closing in. Between your mind and whatever you've got going on here, Adam waved a hand up and down, catching my knee. It rested there. You're the definition of marriageable. The champagne had taken root. Gently shaking off his touch, I gestured to the lines on my forehead that were daily becoming more defined. Not for long, I said. This city is poison. I'll buy you sunscreen for Christmas. I need to leave LA. Hey, Adam kicked my stool. Don't say that. The couple next to him was laughing about something. Authentic, joyous laughter. That they shouldn't be suffering in their cliche of a life was a gross injustice. So what's the backup plan? Adam said, less a question than a demand. I didn't have a backup plan. I'd never needed one. Sell the family jewels? He said. Are there any? Sell the family jewels, I said. Are there any? I took a scoop of the elevated baby food that had arrived with our next course. The only vegetables I was beginning to gather we were likely to catch hint of all night. Maybe the matchmaking's not the worst idea. Just marry rich. Adam pointed a thumb at the couple, which I quickly covered in my fist. Right. Find a nice doctor in Oklahoma who's cousins with my parents' friend's nephew from the mosque. Like a real doctor or your kind of doctor? I arched my eyebrows, and he smiled sheepishly. Okay, this stuff doesn't exactly help, he sipped his wine. But hear me out here. It's 2019, and you're an academic, which means you're not much better off than the heroine of a 19th century novel. Finishing your PhD is like your dad dying. The house is going to some idiot third cousin who fancies himself a philosopher, and you, meanwhile, the legit brains, are about to get shucked out on the street. It is a truth universally acknowledged. That's your big advice. Either you get hitched to someone with an inheritance, or you can give up on ever reading another book, let alone writing one. You won't have time working at the factory. Okay, yeah, I'm on it. I took his glass and drained the white. When I die, Adam said solemnly, you can take the house. You mean the one that's not yours? He smiled. That very one. Scholarship kid or not, Adam had the security of a pending inheritance. When she got pregnant with Adam during her senior year of college in '87, Sharon was bought out by her boyfriend's old money Pasadena parents. They offered her a rundown bungalow in a then undesirable part of town, on condition that she leave their wasp son alone to do his wasping in Pasadena in peace. 3 decades later, and Sharon was now sitting on a gold mine that mined itself. Assuming the LA housing market continued to climb as steeply as it had since the 90s, by the time Adam's investment vested, that is, when Sharon dropped dead and the house became his, you could depend on astronomical returns. This windfall, due sometime in our 60s, would neatly ready Adam for retirement, regardless of what came of his day job. And what about the missus? I now asked Adam. Whatever waif's willing to take the title. I'd still call you doctor. He looked me straight in the eyes. Popping the head off one of the roses, I tried to make light of things. And how much do you make these days? I plucked a petal, then a second petal. Let's talk figures. I refused to look at him, but could feel the weight of his gaze on my body. Where's that dress from again? I'd thrown on a plain silk slip from Goodwill, the big one in Atwater, which sold by the pound. The airy silk had come in under $1, leaving ample room to pay the tailor. I can't remember, I said. Adam gently took the decimated rose and brushed the petals from my lap. I had thick tights on. Forget the pedicure, I hadn't waxed my legs since last quarter. And again, even through layers of fabric, my stomach shrank from the thrill of his touch. It was like discovering a seashell I'd once hid in a shoebox. You really do look, he gestured around. It's like all this was made for you. Another course came and went. In our wine glasses, the sun set from white to orange, soon to red. Our knees were knocking and my head was swirling. This wasn't supposed to feel like this. Suddenly, we were all clapping. One of the gay guys in the couple next to me had proposed. I withdrew my leg. $50 says you're back with Julia by Monday morning. I'll raise you 100. Adam raised his glass. Come on. Why else send you that screenshot of her Uber ride? They just broke up before this conversation. Giving Adam the address was a taunt, but also an invitation. It's like, fuck you and fuck me at all at the same time. Adam put down his silverware. I attacked my plate, speaking between bites. You both do it, punish each other. You're here with me, she's at the bar, and you know how to find her. Tonight, makeup sex. Tomorrow, tears, apologies, promises. Monday, you're back together. Except there's even less trust. Plus the high of the whole mess, to say nothing of the fact that Julia's constitutionally unfit for monogamy. He crossed his arms. Whether it's in a month or a year, I continued, the cycle's doomed to recur. The only way out is to change the terms. Just admit you're in an open relationship. Clearly, I wasn't the only one who needed to revisit my Nietzsche. Adam stared at me, tapping a finger against his knee. Eventually, it slowed. I know it's hard for you to have feelings, he said, or to have other people have feelings. This was the problem with friendship. Sometimes you got red. Okay. So, as the book goes on, she takes this joke of marrying rich seriously, and she starts dating in LA quite strategically. And she has this goal. She hasn't been given summer teaching, and she has this goal of getting engaged by the date the fall quarter starts at UCLA. So sometime in midsummer, that all goes awry, and she finds out that her father's in the hospital. Her father is Iranian, and her mother, who's Indian and an English professor at this point, and provost at a small college, is going to Iran for only the second time in her life. It's the third time in the narrator's life. They both need to go to Iran to take care of him. So she gets to Iran. They go to the hospital. We know by this point her relationship with her mother is quite strained. And her father goes through an emergency surgery successfully. And so for the first time in 24 or 36 hours since landing, she is able to go back home at that point, and her mother stays in the hospital. So let me start us. Okay. I won't get into the details, but somehow she ends up with this flirtation with the neighbor based on her being in the courtyard and the neighbor seeing her from her balcony. And then the neighbor tells her to come over. She's having a party. So, okay, date number 90, the girl next door. Making a tight turn, I buzzed the top unit at the neighbors. The laughter and music tumbling off her balcony had picked up again, and I held down the buzzer. Though I hadn't had the guts to step into the street without some semblance of hijab, throwing my shawl over whatever I had on, I had foregone the manteau. I was now out in public in jeans and a wife beater. I wished she'd hurry. Instead of the pedestrian door, the car gate yawned open. I walked over. The tile sloped down into the gaping mouth of basement parking. The building was set back, flush with my father's, and the ramp was in the open air. To the right, where the pedestrian door would have led me, lay the vestige of the old courtyard. The edge that dropped off to the ramp had no safety railing, just a scrim of potted plants. She was standing there, moonshine in hand. Big curls, red lipstick, Kahlo-esque eyebrows. Finding a gap between two plants, she lowered herself to the ramp, then retrieved the whiskey from the ledge. Come, come. Such a nice night, I said, pulling off my shawl as we stepped toward each other. Up close, I saw her eyes were drawn in thick black kohl. Not eyeliner, but kohl, an indie affectation to match the vest. The kohl had migrated into her under-eye wrinkles, and I figured she was about 40. It was then that I remembered that I hadn't redone my makeup after my shower. Between going au naturel and my wife beater, this constituted false advertising. Let's stay down here a while, she said, starting down the ramp and waving a hand up toward the balcony. My friends are trash. They're going to get us all arrested. I followed, trying not to trip down the steep slope in my father's shoes. At the bottom, beyond the usual Asian make sedans, an open-topped shed occupied the last parking spot. The bricks closest to the cars, tan like the building, were black with exhaust. A simple wood bench stood on one side. It's nice and quiet here, she said, taking a seat. We can talk. We didn't talk. We drank, sipping straight from the jar. The air sparked, and yet we sat without touching. I realized I'd never flirted in Farsi, and I wondered when this shit would kick in. What's in here? I knocked on the shed. See for yourself. Inside, the shed was lined with shelves. Ceramics in various states of undress sat in disarray, unglazed, half-glazed. A silver kiln gleamed in the far corner, vented to the outside, by the looks of it, probably into an open air shaft like that behind my father's house, via an umbilical cord that ran straight through the back wall. In other words, it was an expensive setup, custom, and the kiln was so shiny it looked new. Is this your work? I asked. Yes, sir. You just started? She raised her eyebrows. No, my dear. I've been working for a long time. But I didn't know the word for kiln. Machine? It doesn't have a scratch. Fresh from Europe. I gave the old one to a friend. My back to her, I heard the flicker of a lighter. The sweet toxicity of a cigarette filled the small space. There was a row of finished work, sculptures sort of, each the size of a dinner plate, except ovular and with the center punched out. The outer rims were bulbous, the inner edges raw and toothy. Vaginas, clearly. Or rather, mangled vaginas. Feel free, she said, taking a drag as I turned to look at her, if you have any critiques. She almost sounded sincere. My first thought was that the work was derivative, stuck in the second wave. Judy Chicago came to mind, of course. During undergrad, I'd made a pilgrimage to Brooklyn to view the dinner party, that icon of 70s American feminism. But then again, these works were much more visceral, less ornate. There were real holes in the middle, holes the artist had cut from her own creation, from, in a sense, her own flesh. It's about violence against women? I said. In a way. The only finished work was unequivocally gorgeous. Dark, rich hues like navy and black in a high shine glaze that still looked wet. Is it easy to show this stuff here? I asked, knowing that I'd already given myself away. Clearly, I wasn't from here. She smiled wryly. There's a difference between seeing and comprehending. You can show people what they won't see without getting into trouble. She came and toyed with a figurine on another shelf, a big-bellied nude that fit in her palm. Or you can always just show the work to certain people. You do a lot of private viewings? Still stuck on the plates, I wanted to finger the hole. Without asking permission, I touched the gash of a semi-finished work. I felt a prick, blood beading on my fingertip. What happened? She took my finger and sucked it clean. A shiver crawled through me. Our breath sounded against the still basement air. She leaned in to kiss me. Long, but not hard. Long enough that by the time I felt her below, her touch was solace, the easing of an ache. It was then that she told me her name, Layli, after the star-crossed lovers Layli and Majnun. In the poem, the tragic heroine drives her beloved crazy, or Majnun, while she's called after the Arabic word for night, Layl. The more common name Layla came from the same root, but this version insisted on the classical reference, a mark of high culture. It was a matter of the final vowel, which sighed itself into oblivion. Layli, meaning of the night. Thank you. Oops. There we go again. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Rahmani, for that reading, and for agreeing to come over to USC and visit us and chat with us. like Neetu said, we were so excited when we read this book. We were so excited when you agreed to come to campus. I was telling everybody in the program about it, all of my friends. I had to buy a second copy of the book because one of my friends stole it and never gave it back. So really, I think our department has been so excited, and we're so happy you're here. And there's just something special about this novel, I think especially for us complit folks in Los Angeles. And beyond just its resonance, its critique and commentary on academia, but also its sort of love letter to academia, there's something special about, I think, the way that this novel is written. The narrative structure, the form, the lush, spiky, surprising prose. On my reread, the humor struck me with full force again, and I blame you for making me snort really loudly on the Metrolink. So I'm really happy to be a respondent today. And I mean, for me personally, and I promise I won't spend too much more time belaboring the point about relatability or representation or identification, but the experience of reading this book felt incredibly unique. A young Muslim academic in Los Angeles for the first part of the book, who's watching rom-coms, worrying about money, crafting syllabi, writing job applications, contending with parents, fretting about her spinster status. It was all quite uncanny. So on that level, this text resonated with me, excited me, made me feel the sense of finally somebody's writing about all of this. But of course, the scholar in me knows that there's more to discuss about the novel than that personal relationship to it, although the novel itself allows for boundaries around scholarship and the personal to collapse, or posits that these boundaries have always been porous, that living and loving and reading and writing and researching are, for the academic, co-constitutive, intertwined, inextricably linked. And I think that's the first thematic thread I'd like to dig into a little bit in this response. And to help, I'd like to read 2 sentences from the beginning of the novel, and actually it's perfect because it's the same scene in K-Town. So it's really me rereading part of what Adam says in that conversation that sort of instigates the narrator's quest to marry rich. I was really struck by those 2 lines. Adam says, "It's 2019 and you're an academic, which means you're not much better off than the heroine of a 19th century novel. Finishing your PhD is like your dad dying. The house is going to some idiot third cousin who fancies himself a philosopher, and you, meanwhile, the legit brains, are about to get shucked out on the street." There's so much in those 2 sentences, which became even richer to me during my second read of the novel, knowing that everything, knowing what would transpire with the narrator and her father. And Adam here is using real estate and inheritance as sort of metaphors, but both are very much material and literal considerations throughout the novel, and I want to get into that a little bit more later as well. But before I comment on that, I want to think about how this book thinks about literature and about reading. The narrator, after all, responds, as you read, to Adam's claims with, "It is a truth universally acknowledged, that's your big advice." So literature, literary reference, the mode of intertextuality here are serving as a shorthand. Citation is a language in its own right, and it shapes how these 2 characters, a scholar and a poet, communicate with each other. This quotation is also more generally indicative of how the narrator interacts with the world, the way that film and literature converge to shape her approach to relationships, her understanding of the social, the culture, the cultural, the material. The academic and personal weave together almost seamlessly. Her dissertation research critiques companionate marriage, and while on her quest to secure a financially eligible match, she crafts a syllabus on chick flicks. It's a class I would very much like to take. She has a couple different titles she offers for the first unit. The first is From Making Friends to Making Love, or alternatively, From Hey You to I Do. And then there were some like PG-13 titles as well. I just thought this was so funny and so real. And this is all to say that there's an incredibly rich representation of the way in which research is embodied. The narrator really lives in this collapsed boundary between between theory and practice. And then I want to go back to that sort of thread on real estate, because it's a thematic thread that is really interesting to me, and is connected to homelands, property, land, space, the house going to that idiot third cousin. I want to think with you about the way that space is constructed in this novel, on these macro and micro levels, the global space of immigration, diaspora, translation, cultural transmission, the urban spaces of Los Angeles and Tehran, and then space in terms of belonging, both in its expansive figurative capacity, belonging in terms of complex lived-in configurations of gender, culture, sexuality, religion, and then belonging in terms of ownership, concrete material reality of real estate. Both our protagonist and Adam come to be sort of unsteadily tethered by inheritances, by houses in Tehran and Los Angeles, respectively. So I'm interested in inheritance as it relates to belonging, to both senses of that word, belonging. And just a last point about space, and also I suppose about the reading life and real life intersecting and blending into one another. I just wanted to say that in rereading this book now in this moment, after just 1 year away from it, to see on the page Tehran, a city not often and not always rendered with such care, fullness, complexity, to read that city on the page while getting world news updates on my phone made my rereading all the more powerful. Made an already layered sense of loss in part 2, set in Tehran, even more layered. And there was a line in the last 10 pages of the novel that moved me differently and even more on this reread, and it's as follows. Quote, later on my father's 40th day of mourning, a snapshot from Layli would brighten my phone at home in LA. Pomegranates in full blush, the last of their greenness gone forever. End quote. And I'll stop there and open for questions.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I will stand up here and field questions. While people are formulating, maybe I can piggyback on some of these questions because I had similar ones. Talking about real estate, actually, a very good friend of mine, Gilan, who I remember I was telling you, she was also a PhD student in comparative literature and was working on the Blind Owl, psychoanalytic readings of the Blind Owl, which is an intertext, very explicitly of this text. She asked this question about inheritance. I'm going to try to ask this question without spoilers. I think I can do it. Okay, so I'm going to read her question. Question about inheritance. She has a question about inheritance in real estate and how that connects to the title of Liquid. If I remember correctly, the long-term future non-liquid assets that await the protagonist with Adam, quote unquote, the white guy, is a Venice house that he can't really access until his mom kicks the bucket. And that he will inherit because his mom was basically bought off by his father, who didn't want to deal with him after he was born, right? The Pasadena Wasps. And that, and what she has, the protagonist has in Tehran, is an inheritance supposedly from her father, but that her mother, despite herself, actually made possible, right? So she says, I feel like there's something interesting here with the ambivalence around these always already corrupt gifts of the future. And then, of course, so this question of liquid assets, very interesting. And then, of course, there's a twist at the end with as my friend calls, the guy that Adam's mom ends up with. She calls him the nothing burger of the white guy. That was in our text thread what his name was. Anyways, so that puts a whole twist on the whole thing. So I'm going to throw that into the real estate question. The other question I'm going to ask, and this ties to our class very directly, which is that so in our class we've been studying the city novel. And we started with Mrs. Dalloway, which is a kind of classic kind of bourgeois upper class woman, and we looked at the relationship between the way in which she's moving through space and the way in which physical space and psychic space get intertwined and mapped onto each other, and the kind of freedom that she experiences as a kind of flaneur moving around the city, right? And then we looked at how that gets reworked from a variety of other positions, particularly like what happens to the city novel or the modernist novel when the protagonist is a working class West Indian immigrant facing xenophobia and race, the way that, you know, these, like those characters, and we were looking at this novel called Lonely Londoners by Sam Selvin in the 50s novel, right? And this group of West Indian immigrants in moments of the Windrush era, right, post-colonial immigrants coming to London, and they can't move in the same way that Mrs. Dalloway can move, and so they have to remap the city in various ways, and also so they find different paths, they almost create a different city, right, and then the novel has to be remade, right? The novel has to be remade because the modernist novel of the Bloomsbury group does not have the capacity to narrate the consciousness of a working class immigrant, post-colonial immigrant, right? So that whole form has to be remade in order to accommodate or to reimagine the subject position of the post-colonial immigrant, right? And so I really had that in mind when I was thinking about what you've done with Los Angeles and Tehran, and thinking about, thinking about what you do with space in Los Angeles. And just like Mrs. Dalloway, in this novel, you can literally map every single moment. We know exactly where everybody is, right, by name. We know how they get there. We know how they take the routes. Freeways are really important, right? There might, there is space of freedom, but also not, right? I mean, all the kind of entrapments and enclosures of the city, as well as the spaces of freedom, right? And the way that she moves through Los Angeles, the way technology mediates it, that blue dot on the phone, right? Like, you really had to remake and rework the novel form and the romance form in order to narrate this experience of Los Angeles, and also like all these scenes in the car, and how much the car rolling down the Hollywood Hills, for example, which is a hilarious moment, but also that cup holder that holds the secret, so clever, like the cup holder that holds the secret of the necklace, right? Is and so just thinking about all the ways in which our technologies of movement that have to do with how we move in the city, which has everything to do with how we can afford to move in the city, right? Whether we're taking the bus, whether we're taking the train, whether we're taking an Uber, whether we're walking. And so I'm really interested in thinking about how you had to reimagine Los Angeles and the role that LA plays in this novel. And then she goes to Tehran, and then all of a sudden her movements are completely different. And it's like, and it reminds me very much of this kind of Frantz Fanon moment in Black Skin, White Masks, where he is just trying to, like, he's talking about the fact that he's just lighting a cigarette and leaning back in a chair, but he can't even do that unhabituated. Like, it's not it's like, for everybody else it's a habituated movement. I'm just smoking a cigarette, and I'm not thinking about it. But for Frantz Fanon, because he's a black subject in France and a post-colonial subject in France, that very phenomenology has to be reworked such that he feels every single muscle and every single sinew and every single movement. He feels the cigarette, right? He feels every little thing, because he has a double or triple consciousness, right? And so in Tehran, it's very much that, even though there is very much a double consciousness and triple consciousness, but the kind of gendered, racialized subject, right? And and the way in which all these movements are kind of thought and overthought and rethought, right? And nothing is kind of habituated, and everything a bit of a struggle, or I wouldn't say struggle, but it's very conscious, hyper-conscious. There's a hyper-consciousness that comes to the kind of bodily being that protagonists can't move habitually anymore, right? And so when you said to me that some people think of this novel as two novels smushed together, I was like, no, absolutely not. It's that amazing move, right, where that the protagonist moved from the habitus of Los Angeles and the habitus to Tehran that really, makes it in this really profound way. So just some things, whatever threads you want to pull from that, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
No, thank you. I mean, there was so much there, and also, Mahnur, in your comments as well. So let me see if I can kind of tie some of these together. I think starting where we left off, real estate is really connected to this city question here and mapping the city. And the choice to split the time, to have half of the novel take place one place and half the other place. So I think kind of going backwards, what struck me when you were talking just now, Nitu, in terms of the precision of the mapping in Los Angeles, absolutely that doesn't exist in Tehran, and there's actually a consciousness around how she doesn't know where she's going. She'll get in a car, and if they could take whatever route, she just has to trust that they're going to get her there. the only avenue that's ever named is the main avenue by the house, because she knows that if she needs to get home, that's how she can name, tell the taxi where to go. And so a couple of things. Like, one, I think that the precision in LA really mimics the surveillance experience of being a Muslim in post 9/11 America. Mm-hmm. Like, there's a way that on the one hand, it's actually kind of this like tourist guide to LA. I was in New York just before flying here last weekend, and a friend of a friend said that he's in a writing group where they are all old friends. They've grown up in Manhattan, and they had a lot of fun with the book because of how precise it is about LA. It was like this kind of escape for them. Traditionally in the U.S., like intellectual novels are about New York, mm-hmm. And so that, I think, like everything in the book, it's like it's double-edged. Like, on the one hand, it's this kind of fun, spritzy, you could follow her pathway and have a pretty good time, honestly. Or like, it's just like, it is the kind of mimicking the surveillance levels of precision that mm-hmm. every single movement, including often like what highway she's on, mm-hmm. what the avenues, boulevards she took to get there, if she's taking surface streets, all of that is made visible. Mm-hmm. And, I think in terms of the spaces, like zoom out spaces of LA and Tehran, it was very important to me that the book operate like a couplet in that way. So if you read one hemisphere, it doesn't make sense. Or you think it makes sense, but it's just not the meaning it has when you pair it with the other half. Mm-hmm. So that was essential to me, that move. Though I will say, when I started writing the book, Neetu and I were talking a little bit about process before getting here, on our way over here, and I didn't
on Flower Street. We took Flower Street.
Yes, yeah, I was going down Flower. Right. And I did not think that the book would go to Iran. When I wrote this book, I started with a very crude outline. It was like on the back of an envelope, just big plot points and where she would be. Of course I didn't follow it, but it's like you have to create a outline to be able to write anything, but not the thing you outlined. But then as I was writing, there was a moment where I just I wanted to move her to Tehran. And I knew at the time that it was just leaning into my own melancholia of not being able to go for some time. I used to go to Iran. I started traveling there when I was 18. I'm ethnically, both sides of my family are Iranian. We can talk in a moment about why the narrator is half Indian. But I started traveling there alone at 18, and I went once or twice a year by myself. It's not a place that I've only experienced mediated through family. And very different than the narrator. I don't feel quite as lost. But what was important to me, though, was to destabilize her. Like, she's such a know-it-all in the first half, and she thinks she has everyone's number. Mm-hmm. That I really needed her to be that lost, and actually to collapse, therefore be able to collapse the distance between her emotional experience and her spatial experience of the city at hand. Mm-hmm. So when she's in Tehran, in some ways, it's much more honest, because her relationship to the city is reflecting how lost she is in life. And that was important to me. But I also, a lot of like what used to be called immigrant fiction, people don't like using that term anymore, but it still just is that, like the way that my publisher, I'm sure, looked at acquiring this book, for example, books by like hyphenated Americans or whatever we want to call it. a lot of times, and this is changing, I think it's changing in a really interesting way in the past 5 years, like very recently. But a lot of times the kind of homeland, the books that I grew up reading, there's a vagueness to that space, and there's a fetishization.
Mm-hmm.
And it was important to me to humanize Tehran and Iran by having it be quite precise, and it's just as descriptive, and you know what she's eating, and you know what like the rooms look like, and you know what people are wearing. But like we said, she doesn't have a handle on the city, and so that is reflected in the text. But I think like in terms of the cynicism around the real estate question, the phrase that was used, always already corrupted, like the promise, the capitalist
future, right.
promise, that's always already corrupted. I think that the book, that's a wonderful way of putting it. And what the book contends with is this bind of, that's true, but to reject the promise is also not viable in some ways. Like she needs to find a way to make space for herself, and it is the kind of wolf, old thing of like a room of her own. She needs a room of her own, and she doesn't get it in this book. I mean, if you end up reading the whole thing, but I think that contending with that is important, but I don't have an answer in that, like, it's not settled. And it's not settled for me personally. I mean, I think a lot of us maybe feel that way. But, the other thing I just wanted to say similarly, what really struck me, Mahnur, when you were talking about the porousness in the book between, I'll call it life and love, but really kind of money and love, like the structures of like, how is she gonna make her living from this field she wants to be in, but then also her love of the field. I think that porousness is compelling, like for those of us who were naive enough or whatever, I'll talk about myself, to like try to do this in this day and age. That's what's compelling about it. That's what's attractive. And in some ways that's what's beautiful, but it's also what's so dangerous. The fact that like she's being so emotionally, existentially derailed by things not working out how she wanted in her career, that's quite dangerous. And that's a vulnerability that she's opened herself up to, she's cultivated, And so, again, that's not something I have a solution for, but I think that's actually that's like a central bind of what we call intellectual labor in our current form of capitalism. But even that, I think that phrase is really interesting, because if we actually treated it like labor, none of us would do it. Like the returns just aren't there,
Right.
And we've found ways to talk about, in other ways, okay, we might talk about emotional labor, how that's like an uncompensated, but this is much more complicated than that, because it's about our relationship to ourselves. It's not a performance of, smiling for the students or something like that. Also goes into teaching, but it's a different issue.
Right.
I know many people here are students, but that's part of what I think is interesting and difficult about environments like this, like the room that we're in and the conversation we're having.
And what we're doing in this room together, right? Yeah. Questions?
Could I, maybe as people think about it, I'll just say quickly about the Hidayat.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Sadiq Hidayat's The Blind Owl is widely regarded as the first novel in Farsi. It's from 1937. Farsi was really valued verse and poetry for many centuries, if not millennia. And so it was a late adopter of the novel and of fiction. Like the first short story is dated to 1921. And I say adopter quite it was specifically a kind of Francophilic, some writers who had spent time in France bringing those forms in. So, all of that is kind of good to know. And The Blind Owl is a kind of strange book. Some people call it a fever dream. Some people say that it's like a drug hallucinated experience, the whole book. But it's this kind of, not quite stream of consciousness, but it's a first-person narrator. It departs from realism, is why people sometimes have these explanations of like, oh, he's on drugs and that's why there is a random character just like walking out of a painting into his house, or but the narrator is technically half Indian. The book is not discussed this way in Iranian studies at all. I mean, that I've seen. I actually really would be interested in Ilan's work. Mm-hmm. But at least the scholarship I've been exposed to, and certainly not in terms of the reading public, whether it's in translation or in Iran. But he, part of the engine of the narrative, in that it fuels a lot of his thoughts, which is just the plot or these kind of dream-like scenes, is the fact that his mother is an Indian dancer and his father was a kind of traveling salesman who met her, and she had this child. It's not like it's not explained. It's just purposefully not just like every step of the way. You don't really know, but and he has this kind of obsession with his mother. So she appears and reappears as a kind of fetishized subject, that this brown feminine body being quite fetishized as a dancer, being sexualized very explicitly, and just reading it. When I was in graduate school, I didn't think I was going to end up doing this, but I ended up focusing on modern and contemporary Persian, like on Farsi. And that book just always got under my skin. And what more got under my skin is that nobody talked about it that way. And so one of the things I started looking into, and there is actually some really good scholarship now, recent scholarship on like racialization in Iranian texts and blackness, anti-blackness in particular. But that stuff wasn't really published at the time, and I was thinking about this, and it just stayed with me. And then on the other hand, like it's one of the few books that the American literati know from contemporary, or it's not contemporary, but from modern Farsi. It's like one of the few titles, and it's been translated 2 or 3 times, which is incredibly rare. Like most things don't even get translated once. So I was just really interested in like, what is this what is this blindness? What is this race blindness? And even just the sexism in the novel against Iranian women is also quite remarkable. Like literally, he dismembers a female body at some point, and that's just kind of part of the fever dream, And I was just so interested in like this refusal to acknowledge blindness there's to acknowledge violence and layers of violence that are right there. And I say that in a way that's like, I'm not interested in sanitized text, but what I thought was interesting or disturbing was like how we talk about it, not the fact that it was ever written. But why aren't we talking about that when we talk about this book? And so this narrator, that's a first-person narrator, an unnamed first-person narrator, male narrator, who has an Indian mother and an Iranian father. And so when I wrote this book, I wanted it to be the feminist response to that on some level. So I have an unnamed first-person narrator who's a woman who has an Indian mother and an Iranian father, and she has a real relationship with both, and the mother's a real character and has her own challenges and complexities. And one of the things I was interested in, for example, in terms of just like not idealizing Iran, was the racialization that she would necessarily experience when she went to Iran. So one of the, when I say like the text is not biographical, when I was writing the Iran parts, I always had to pause and think, like, this would, of course this is also true in LA, but like especially in Iran, it really would have, it went more slowly in that sense of I would have to think, okay, this isn't my experience. Like, what would her subjectivity be in this moment? How would people react to her? And how would she experience it? And some of it was just the facts of her life, like the fact that this was only her third time in Iran.
Yeah.
And some of it was this racialization. And we see her working that out from the beginning, where like she gets quite defensive of her mother, but then she also resents her mother for not being able to, in her perception, fend for herself. At some point it becomes very clear that the mother can fend for herself, she just doesn't give a fuck, and so like all of that is there. And I was just I wanted to write a book that had that more complicated relationship to the so-called heritage country.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. It also makes me think it's like almost like a version of the liquid acid house. It's like an inheritance. It's supposed to be, it's a literary inheritance. That's it's supposed to be a gift, but it's actually like a debt, that you have to that you have to like fight against.
Yeah, exactly. Just I would love it if people have questions, but just in terms of really quickly with the title, it definitely plays with like liquid and illiquid assets. So, a liquid asset is like basically money. And an illiquid asset is like you'd have to go through some process, like the house. You'd have to manage to sell the house before it's valuable to you. Even though we think of it as having a one-to-one relationship with money, there actually is a mediated real friction that it would take to convert it to money. And so, as opposed to like stocks or something like that. So I thought that that was something I was really interested in when I was thinking of the title, but I also was insistent on, I wanted to come up with a title that not only had this market terminology, was used as market terminology, but also had some texture to it and like could be interpreted quite viscerally. I didn't want it to just be an abstract concept. Yeah. And then, there are other ways, like, especially when she's in LA, she's kind of liquid because you see her shape-shifting a lot to try to fit the desires, anticipate and then fulfill the desires of her dates. And of course, there's a real danger to that. And yeah.
Yeah, great. Questions?
I'm kind of hesitant to ask this question because it might take our conversation in a different direction. So I'm going to ask the question, but I will be at dinner, so I would love to chat about this later if it's not fitting the tenor. I just want to say what an incredible reading, Mahnur. I'm so welcome to USC, but it's so wonderful to be in conversation about your novel with my I want to say esteemed, but it sounds really tweety,
No,
but really
absolutely.
esteemed colleagues.
Yeah.
I should just say, as a preface to my question, I loved your novel. I read it immediately when it came out. And the way it found me, in a way, is what explains why I'm taking this in a different direction. I'm a historian by training, but I was kind of reading this in the summer when I wasn't a historian, so to speak. And I was really interested, and I should say I've learned so much in this and I feel like I've read the book now 10 times just by listening to all these different layers. My question, though, is really different, which is I read this very much in terms of the romance novel. And I was curious about your relationship to that genre. And I'll just say a few more things if you don't mind, and then respond in whatever way. One of the things that's so interesting, which won't be surprising to all my literary colleagues, but was so interesting to me as kind of like an amateur reader in that sense, was just how the romance novel really holds up the industry. And it's made such a huge re-arrival in a way. It's always been a thing, but there's been this new currency around romance novels. As I was reading your book, I was just mesmerized by your playfulness with romance leads, because romance readers have so much power, and they really wield so much power over editors and agents, and there's a kind of expectation that we have to meet as writers. And so I was curious about that, whether whether this is just my experience of the summer, and you have this is not how you're thinking about this novel, and it's not how your editors thought of this novel. That would be interesting. But if they did, what your relationship is to this, because as I was reading it, it felt like exactly the novel that was never available for me to read. In terms of all of the wonderful, comments that have been made so far, geographies, this kind of liquid movement through space and time, and gender and race and so on. But they also seem like a materiality to it in terms of the current literary market, which I was really interested in. So anyway, just a few thoughts, but I was curious, where do you sit on romance panels?
No, that's great. Thank you.
But that would be inappropriate, so in a more official way, I'm asking the question. Yes.
Yeah. I think I'll just kind of talk in this area for a minute. So one thing that I was insistent on was this book's femininity, and it's like unapologetic femininity. And I'm interested in how big books are mask. Their aesthetic is mask, and they often, almost always, have male protagonists and usually male narrators. This is not a big book in that sense. Like, it was not it wasn't pitched that way, it was not critically received that way. But it's interesting to me because at the same time, some of the feedback has been readers find it very off-putting how in the weeds it gets about, let's say, like the Nietzsche joke I read, during the reading, and so like that double speak is really interesting to me in terms of how literature is marketed in the US. And basically, just to put it crudely, it's like an abstract idea spoken by a woman narrator will not be perceived. It doesn't mean that it'll become an intellectual book unless you completely efface her body. So there are a lot of books that I really like, so I'm not going to mention the names of the authors, but some of our, I'll tell you at dinner, but some of the books that I think circulate right now is ideas books by women authors who have women narrators. We have no idea what these people look like. We have no idea whether how that impacts how they're treated. And that's really interesting to me. There's no acknowledgement that, let's say, the smoothness of how they're treated probably means that they are interpreted as sexually desirable, that they're thin, that they have symmetrical faces, that they dress well, whatever. Like, that smoothness exists in the narrator, but we never see we don't actually get confirmation of that. The narrators don't contend with their own bodies. And like that, going against that and both like showing the pleasures of the body, but also really exposing the construction of the female body and of femininity, like even in the, she hasn't waxed, so she can't go bare-legged, according to her own rules for herself. Like that kind of stuff was important to me writing it. Now that said, in terms of how it's been received, I think that the walls are high enough that it hasn't had much impact. Like I think that the book was actually marketed by the press marketing team, which like if just FYI for young people who are like, you really give your book up in a certain way when you give it to a publisher, and the way that they decided to market it, which had very little to do with me or my desires, pushed it in the direction of romance. It was marketed that way, but then those readers it didn't meet their expectations and they felt like there was too much friction. So it was, some of that was itself is these kind of interesting gendered critiques, like, as part of the Book of the Month Club, which for just like the Book of the Month Club is this very old standing book club. It's like Oprah's book club or something, but it's actually been around since the 20s. And so the book reached a pretty wide audience through that. Let me just put it that way. But a lot of those readers, for example, were upset. Like they were like, "Why is she such a bitch?" Why, literally in those words.
Why the protagonist is?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Why are these sentences so difficult to read? This is like in like readers' comments, which I don't read, but have been filtered to me sometimes through people around me. But and like that doesn't upset me at all. But I just find it fascinating. I think like as people doing this work, it's like a really interesting indication of where the culture is, and like who's reading books, what are their expectations, and what kinds of protagonists or narrators will be punished and what for. So, I can get more into the weeds maybe later, but I think that in terms of my own interests, definitely the kind of postmodern aesthetic of high-low is in this book, and that was really important to me. The romance storyline was, on the one hand, it's like, it references 19th century novels. And I remain interested in how, especially in English, less so in, let's say, like German, the novel came into its own through romantic storylines. And that was important to me, engaging that. So it's like on the one hand, there's this intertext of like the Hidayat on the Iranian side. On the other hand, whether it's Austen or George Eliot or, like there are these other, there are English books in English that this book is in response to. But then the romance stuff is mostly in conversation with film and rom-coms. So like personally, I don't read a lot of romance in terms of like what's marketed as the genre of romance. Though I am actually reading one on this trip that because like a colleague like physically gave me this book and I was like, okay, I'll like take this to LA. But I wasn't like thinking in that direction. But you know, the syllabus that she's coming up with, the class she's coming up with is about chick flicks. And I've for a long time been interested in like how strict the storylines are in you know, like film. It's like there are just like such specific, like this is a friends to lovers plot. And so I think like naturally there's a lot of intersection with the genre of romance. But for me personally, I was often thinking about film and like the tropes, and even just like in terms of like you're saying the beats, like what beats need to exist in the dialogue. It's all very scripted. It's timed, and like the scriptedness is something that I'm really interested in. Like that, so much is scripted for her. On the one hand, she has these upper middle class expectations of what life should be. That's scripted. She has these child of immigrant expectations of what her success should look like. That's scripted. She has these ideas that, you know, she can't walk outside with hair on her legs because she's too femme for that. That's scripted, like at every level. And I think that that's how a lot of us live life. And part of what's what I'm interested in, or what the book is about, is that scripts aren't all bad. Like it's also quite pleasurable to watch a movie where you know the end. It's also quite, if you're a person who likes being high femme, if you go out in a high femme outfit, it's very pleasurable, you know? And so like that push and pull, I think, is the irresolution is something that I always like to lean into.
We're going to keep going, but I know that some of my students have other classes to go to, so if you do need to go, take a muffin with you. But we'll keep going. Okay, yes, Alex.
This I'm cheating because I know Mariam. But there was a lot of like conversation around the subtitle being a love story. And of course, if she's taken away from the love and it's not really the book, so like that is intentional. Like any of the words just being like, wait, I thought this was supposed to be a romance. And the contention around like whether or not to add that subtitle, and I'd be curious if your feelings about the novel being a love story have changed at all, or if you feel like how that comes across to you now.
Yeah, there's unfortunately just a real like materialist answer, which is always the most boring one, which is that that was the compromise. I wanted the book to come out as liquid and my publisher wouldn't let me. And then they thought it wasn't marketable enough. So then the compromise was adding this love story subtitle. And as Me Too and Men Who Know, as we were advertising this event, then I recently re-waged this war and won. And so the paperback is coming out just as liquid a novel. But like that whole process, I think, is extremely gendered of like who's the narrator, who's the protagonist, but also who's the author. The fact that I had to put that on the book. Now, at the time, I was like, well, okay, it is like, I was exhausted in some ways, but it also was just like, sure. Like, this book is about love. It's not necessarily about a love story between a man and a woman, but there is that in a kind of more cynical way than I think people realize. Right. But, it's about like her discovering some kind of love for Iran, it's not even, because of its complications. Mm-hmm. It's about her discovering some kind of love for her mother that's quite complicated, that she didn't have. In some more vexed ways, this father she's losing, but also herself. Like there's a coming, I don't want to release a coming of age because it doesn't have a lot of those concerns when we think about like the genre, but there's a kind of like coming to herself that happens throughout the book, and she doesn't arrive, but it has a happy ending in that we at least feel like there's a glimmer of hope that she's getting there, like she's taking the steps to go that way instead of the most cynical route. But yeah, I think that it really interacts with this like genre question of what is the book signaling and to whom.
Hi. Kat. I wanted to ask something in relation to the second excerpt that you read, which was, I really felt like that was a reflection of like her contemplation of her place in like the feminist movement and also a critique of like feminist art, because she was like talking about her experience with this artist and this very like, I guess, direct interpretation of like her femininity. But also like this idea of like desire and temptation, like her, I mean, I really enjoyed that description of like putting her finger in the hole and being pricked by it. And just like that was very like visceral. I love the way that you described that. So I wanted to ask about how you feel about your placement. Is that like your reflection of like your placement producing, as you have mentioned, like a very feminine piece of work, but also like placing yourself in like this very established like field of that, of like feminism that precedes us, and even your critiques of it as well?
Yeah, I think the book certainly thinks of itself as a feminist book, and I think of myself as a feminist. But like, what does that mean? Well, for me, I think that the materialist critique is important. I think that the embodiment, like some of the issues I was just talking about, the fact that like race is on the page, that you know, like other forms of value making based on bodies, ableism is on the page, you know, and I think that all of that can come from different places, but for me, it's really rooted in like a feminist critique and a feminist genealogy. And I also think that there's a way in which, you know, like people, obviously the so-called like waves have been debunked, but at the same time, the reason I did insist on using that in the book is because we do still think that way. Like that's how we imagine the history of feminism, in the US at least. And so, like, I think that one thing I'm interested in is how this book troubles some of the credos. Like, I think some people might even interpret the character as post-feminist, for example, to that point, but she's not. Like, it's really, that's not the answer it's seeking. But some of the kind of pleasure and the makeup and the clothes and like the aesthetics of it, I think are in like uncomfortable relationship to post-feminism, which is something that I've been interested in because I feel like I come up against it a lot, just like in my daily life. It used to be in my students. I think that that's changing. I don't think my students are there anymore. But yeah, so, you know, and then in terms of like the sexual politics, the fact that that stuff is on the page relatively explicit, not actually to the point of a romance genre book, for example, like there is that differentiation in terms of the genre constraints. but there tends to be like the sex scenes kind of collapse into metaphor, or you know, like there's a preoccupation with form and language that takes over often. But without being coy, I wanted to make sure that it wasn't coy. And like that definitely is in relation to feminist writers who have inspired me and whom I go to sometimes, you know, to gather strength. So for example, right now, I just handed in a translation that's coming out next February that is of the Farsi language biography of Furugh Farrokhzad. Furugh is a, you know, mid-century poet who was just both loved and hated at the same time for writing very explicitly about sex in Farsi. And you know, that work is something I'm sure kind of at least at the back of my mind I was thinking about writing this.
I mean, I really enjoy that because I feel like it really resonates what you were saying earlier, which is that it's not necessarily that these things shouldn't be said, but perhaps the way that they're said is what needs to be reframed. So I really like that.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Pallavi. I am a grad student in English here. And I'm really interested in your background as you're somebody with an MFA and also this really rigorous formal training in comp lit. And before I came to USC, I got an MFA and I taught creative writing, and I'm really interested in like, the rise of creative writing, teaching creative writing, and how interested undergraduates are in creative writing, but also the way in which creative writing as a discipline is sort of subordinate sometimes departmentally within English. And so I'm curious to hear from you about how you might think about that tension, or whether when you were writing this novel, whether you felt that it was competing with your research in terms of your time and attention, or whether when you're doing one thing you'd rather be doing the other, or how you kind of balance being of both of those worlds.
Yeah, I think I mean, this is the central problem of my life right now. Like, time is a finite resource, you know? And yeah, when I wrote this book, I had finished my PhD and I was lecturing at UCLA. And I had recently finished the MFA as well. So it was in that moment, but it absolutely meant that all I could do was teach and write the book. I wasn't also trying to edit something for peer review or, you know, and like I think that that's just a reality of many of us have these diverse interests and like diverse frameworks in which we like working, like and diverse languages in which we like working. Like, you know, academia has, and our field in particular, has its own language. And it's just, I think I try to look at it as you know, like a cornucopia, or like enjoying the excess instead of seeing it as a limitation. But sometimes I think like if the question is really just kind of quite personal and like process oriented, like it can be kind of frustrating that I would love to be able to work on a few projects, but I can only ever manage one plus my teaching. So for example, in the fall, I have this problem a lot with translation. I love translating, but if I'm translating a book, it means I'm not working on my own writing, and that's very difficult for me, like even just emotionally. So I have to like space the translations out or be very judicious about what I take on. So yeah, I think in terms of like, did you have almost a more direct question that I'm not answering?
No, I just wanted to hear you speak about it.
Yeah. Oh yeah, you said about creative writing, like the field of creative writing. I think that this is actually a sad reality, like in terms of market trends. More money is being funneled out of English and out of Comp Lit into creative writing. Like I've seen this at a lot of institutions. I think it's safe to say it's a national trend. And the reason that I think it's not going to end well is that if it continues tilting quite as much as it has been, we're going to end up in a situation where people are writing who don't read. And that's a very
100%.
That's a very dangerous place to be. You know, like as a culture, I think it's the quality of the literature is obviously going to go down, and it's just not interesting. I mean, like I think what is interesting as a person and as a field is always to contend with one's history and the history that preceded you, you know, like outside your lifetime. And so,
At various places I've taught before I came here, all the creative writing classes would fill up immediately, and there'd be all these like curriculum battles in the English departments over like what it needs to be a required class and how creative writing fits in. So
yeah.
Yeah, Anna Kornblue has a take on this in her book Immediacy, but she particularly is. I mean, so we were kind of talking about this in the car because I was talking about. I mean, this is like slightly to the side, but when I was in comparative literature, I was at UCLA, and there was like amazing writers teaching creative writing in English, and so I took a class with Joy Harjo and Christina Garcia, and they were like really amazing experiences. But when some of my faculty found out, like they were so angry at me. Like, this is a waste of time. Like, why are you wasting your time? Like, if you're in Comp Lit, you're like, if you're basically if you're doing the study of literature, like the serious study of literature, then you can't be wasting your time doing this thing, right? And it was like, I was really, devastated to hear that. And then, so that I'm really happy that, for example, like my students do that all the time, but there's interesting like history of like where the critical breaks off from the creative. But Anna Kornblue is saying right now that basically everybody's filling up creative writing classes because of the pandemic and because of trauma, and everybody's working through their trauma right now. That basically it's like really not that complicated, that everybody needs to work through their trauma, and so everybody's like, that is the outlet. Like it's so hard to find a therapist, it's so fine, and so everybody's just working, and it's very interesting. And she hasn't. It's a very interesting. It's a very interesting polemic. It's very controversial, but she's very concerned about what happens to literature if this becomes the model, right? And then she was saying too that like also like literature departments are also like very proud of themselves for all the women of color and people of color and queer and disabled people that are coming in to write about their stories, right? And again, this being some kind of like a marker of like how diverse now the marketplace is getting, but then again, who is going to get jobs and what is that going to look like? And also, what happens to this question of like what happens to the study of literature is a really interesting one,
Yeah, is there, I think need to maybe is the contention that the kind of lower level labor is being performed by the women of color, but they're not landing the jobs that actually allow for research, or like what's the...
You mean like why did I get in trouble for taking creative writing, or no?
Oh no, like in this Kornblue. I thought maybe that was the second part of the Kornblue critique. I was just interested in what the...
So so this is a part of a larger critique about what she is saying that is happening to art and literature, which she's saying that, like, it kind of precisely what you're talking about, like all these questions of mediation are disappearing, so that people are, that, that the way in which art is being consumed is as if it's immediate. That this question of mediation is being evaporated. So she gives this example of the Van Gogh experience where you can actually do yoga in this immersive. I mean, it's kind of like very low-hanging fruit. She opens with this, image, but she's looking at a variety of different. She's looking at film. She's looking at literature. Alex, do you know this text? No. Okay. But so she. I mean, it has a lot of problems. This polemic does. This text does, but it is, for example, has a whole chapter about MFA programs, and yeah.
I'm reading the program era right now.
Oh, right, exactly. So this is the definitive text on this right now. But yeah.
Right.
But what she's saying, her concern is like what's happening to this. It's as if like all literature then becomes reducible to one's own experience, without a critical. Like, for example, like you have so much control and play with the romance form, right? Which we're talking about, right? And the way and you know all the kind of self-consciousness around the way in which this plot has to unfold, maybe sometimes against our desires or maybe through our desires. And so one of the conversations that I had with a lot of the conflicts were like alternative plots. Like, well, what if she ends up with, you know, or what if this happens, right? Like, and the novel also lends itself to that because it's so self-conscious and has so much control over the romance plot, right? So, but that's like a textbook case of mediation and why it's so important, right? That you can have some critical distance, right? But there's this fear, at least on Anna Kornbluh's side, that like if all literature just becomes reducible to experience, or it's just about the personal, then what happens to the study of what happens to the political power of literature is another way of putting it.
Yeah, well, you're absolutely correct in terms of just this small book, which is that I think a lot of people like missed the way that, and it's like readers are trained to read a certain way, so that's interesting in itself. It's not like a personal responsibility, but I think a lot of readers missed the cynicism around the end, the inevitability, and the fact that it couldn't have ended any other way and still have claimed to be what it was.
Right.
And I mean, almost everyone, like when I say a lot, really almost everyone. And in terms of the reviews, only one person has caught it, and it wasn't. She was a big supporter of the book in terms of like lists and stuff, but she didn't even author of formal reviews, so it's never been like written about in that way. And I think that it's just interesting because like when I was writing it, there was a draft of it in which the intertext was much quieter.
Interesting.
Because I was like, oh, of course everybody knows that this is what, and then through the editing process and my own editing process, I realized, oh no, I like need to make very clear what structural issues this is in conversation with, literally, titles, etc. And to the point of like, I thought it was getting boring at a certain point, like it was just really hitting the nail on the head. And so it's been interesting to see how it's not interpreted that way, nevertheless. Which in some ways it's like, okay, maybe that's a failing of the book. Like, I'm not necessarily saying the book is doing everything right and the readers are doing everything wrong, but I just think that it's about training. Like, we're in a cultural moment in which realism, like I feel like realism in itself is necessarily a spatial metaphor. We're always thinking about what's the space between the representation and the real.
Right.
So
this is what Anna Kornbluh is calling immediacy.
Yeah,
so like what she's saying, like what she would say to this,
collapsing.
right? So what she would say to this is that it's a readerly shortcoming, because readers are not trained, as you're saying, to look for the mediation, right, or the critical distance that's happening, or the cynicism directed towards the form, right, and then which is mediating the story in relation, or in relationship to. I'm sure people also like reduce this to your biography or something like that, right? And so this is a problem what she's calling mediation and immediacy, right? And so that's why you then have to overcorrect or build in these. Look over here, it's mediated, right? It's just exactly what she's talking about.
Yeah, well, and I think the other interesting thing is like how, where am I trying to go with this? you know, the other side of it that isn't about readers is like one thing I was interested in was how do we, as politically conscious, extremely aware, you know, relatively subjects, you know, probably like everybody in this room, the narrator or whatever, it's like you've been trained to think about the world in a certain way, to really see the scaffolding behind everything. But at the same time, like politics often can't answer to love, can't answer to death, can't answer to, in some ways, real life questions. You know, I say that knowing that there's a complication of what's real life and whatever. But, and that is something, on the other hand, like moving away from the critique we were just talking about, that tension was something I was really interested in bearing. The fact that she understands the structures she's falling in and she knows the storyline. She does also genuinely love this person.
Yeah.
And like, where does that leave her politics? Does it change her politics? Does it not? Does it mean, you know? And I think that we don't, even in feminist studies, which has contended with this question a lot, maybe I haven't read the right text, but in some ways I think that that's an area like we haven't been able to answer. Like we have this kind of the cliche of the personal is political, but then there actually is this really like troubled consciousness in a lot of our lives in terms of like what do we think and stand for versus like what are the nuts and bolts and what are the relationships we're in and who are the people we love. And there's often a mismatch. Like that was something that really interested me when I was a graduate student, both putting that mirror up to myself but also seeing it in colleagues, seeing it in professors. And I think it's like insufficiently theorized. I mean, that's like an annoying phrase, but part of the book, I think, was just trying to lean into that tension.
Yeah. The questions. All right. Well, I think we will wrap up. There are copies of the novel in the back for sale that can be autographed. If you'd like to pick one up. Thank you so much for coming. This was so much fun.
Really
so wonderful.
Such a pleasure. Thank you.
Have you here.